Thank you for having me here. And I was asked to talk about litigation, court-related issues. But before I do that, because everyone's talking about elections, I want to give you the flip side of two things in the Wisconsin Constitution that most people don't know. In 1848, the original Wisconsin Constitution, it was published in German and Norwegian, as well as in English. Because most, or a huge number, and I believe it was most, of the people who were living here at that time didn't speak English. The second thing about the first Wisconsin Constitution of 1848 was that it allowed immigrants to vote before they became citizens, if they were white. And it was very explicit, any white immigrant who has declared their intention to be a citizen. So there was a process, and you would say, I'm going to become a citizen in a few years down the road. And as long as you said you wanted to do it, and you were white, of course, you were allowed to vote, and male. So that lasted until 1908, around the time that lots of Poles and Eastern Europeans and Jews and Italians and Greeks, who were at the time not considered to be white, they were considered to be of other races, started coming into this state and many other states, and then suddenly the Constitution was changed because we didn't want those people voting. So I just think that that's a good thing to have in your minds when you hear some of what you hear now. So I wanted to talk a little bit, not because I expect anyone to remember all these court cases, but because I think what the ACLU on a national level is litigating, and the ACLU is a national organization, shows the breadth of the attack on immigrant communities today. There actually is very little, and actually no litigation currently that I'm aware of in Wisconsin, but these issues all affect people in Wisconsin, and they touch on things every speaker today has been talking about. So, for example, there was the litigation over the Muslim ban, which is, call it what it is, which unfortunately, after the third round, the US Supreme Court found was within presidential authority. There are now people looking, there's supposed to be a waiver process, so a few people from these countries might be allowed in, and there is some investigation going on right now by advocates to see if that waiver process actually exists at all, which is not clear. There are cases before the Supreme Court right now on the right to bail in immigration detention. So again, you have this mass lockup of immigrants and this includes persons who are here legally who might have, as the person who introduced us said, not registered a change of address or done any minor thing, who are being deprived of bail. And there is now a legal fight going on as to whether people should be allowed to have bail during the time that their cases are being heard. There is, as I'm sure all of you know, the litigation over family separation and detention, tearing children away from their parents, and then doing it in a way where they didn't even keep track, in many cases, of which child belonged to which parent. They are still, months later, have not been able to reunite all these families. There were hundreds of parents who were deported without their children and deported to places where, there's barely phone service, much less internet. So that is an ongoing struggle and just shows how, as we all know, how horrific the attacks have been. There is the termination of what was called temporary protected status, which was a status that allowed people from communities where there had been disasters to remain in the U.S. It was terminated in a number of countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, and Sudan, not because those conditions had actually improved, but the court cases that are going on now are showing that there was all this internal discussion about how can we justify what we've already decided we're going to do. Find us evidence to make it look like things are better there so we can get all these people out of those A-hole or S-hole or whatever we call, or some call countries, out of the United States. I mean, that's clearly what was going on. There is litigation, I don't think this is an ACLU case, but nationally going on for the young people who were beneficiaries of President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program, again, giving some sort of legal status to people who were brought here as children and who were studying or allowed people to work in the United States, which again was terminated for no good reason other than political hostility. That's also ongoing and been on hold. There is litigation going on over former Attorney General Sessions' decision to eliminate as allowable grounds for asylum being the victim of domestic violence or being the victim of gang violence. You still have to prove to show asylum that your country won't protect you, but there was pretty clearly established law that if you were a DV victim or a gang violence victim and you tried to get help from your government or were in a government that refused to protect you from those situations, that was grounds to seek asylum. And that was just sort of, again, waved away because of somebody's agenda. There is, I think it might have ended in the last day or two, you probably heard about the litigation over the census citizenship question. Again, the US government decided for the first time since 1950 that they were going to ask whether people were US citizens. And if you look at the actual question, it's worse than that. It's like, are you a citizen? Are you naturalized? If you're naturalized, what year are you naturalized on? Are you not a citizen? The clearly goal of this is to strike terror in people. People are not going to answer these questions, or they're not going to answer them truthfully, or both. And what happens if people don't answer the citizenship questions? They don't show up in the counts. So they get fewer representatives in Congress or in the legislature because they don't exist. There is less money for those communities because a lot of the funds you get from the US government are based on population. If people don't exist, then you don't have to give them, money. And of course, people are not going to, whether or not the law says that citizen or that census information can't be used by anyone else, people aren't going to believe that, and for understandable reasons in light of what's going on right now, and aren't going to answer those questions. And at the trial this past week, which was in New York with National ACLU, it was very clear. I mean, they were calling the head census scientists who testified about how ridiculous this question was, how they knew it was going to scare people off, how it wasn't their idea, and ultimately, again, how it was all part of a political agenda. So there are court cases going on. As we saw, unfortunately, the court cases, most of these are buying time. But there's also a limit to how much they can do, as we saw with the Muslim ban cases, when you have a Supreme Court that has a certain perspective on things. So I also want to talk about some of the advocacy and efforts we're making locally. And I really want to emphasize, from the ACLU perspective, and I think from the perspective of everyone on this panel, that the litigation alone isn't enough. Advocacy and litigation can work together in education and community. So I'm here talking about, what the ACLU is doing. Folks are talking about what their organizations are doing, but it's really the people and the communities who are needed to make real change in voting, yes, and just every day. Right now, some of our efforts at advocacy have included over the past year trying to get local law enforcement basically not to be part of Trump's deportation force. There's a special program called 287G where local sheriffs get trained to be essentially immigration agents. Because of advocacy, Milwaukee County, under the prior sheriff, had actually applied to be part of it. It was the only, as far as we know, the only community that was turned down, and it was largely turned down because there was so much opposition within the community, whatever the former sheriff wanted. Waukesha County did get 287G status, which means they've got people trained in the jail, not the officers on the streets, but to question people and potentially turn people over to ICE, which is obviously a concern for us. We did open records requests around the state, and some sheriffs are cooperating with ICE and some are not, and so we're gonna continue working on advocating for that. I want to mention, because of something Jasmine said earlier about Representative Sensenbrenner last decade trying to make being undocumented a crime. I want folks to know that being undocumented is not a crime. The mere fact of unlawful presence is not a criminal violation. If you've re-entered, if you've done certain other things, it could become a crime, but just physically being here and not having documentation is a civil violation. So when you hear people talking about criminals, take that with a grain of salt too. We're also looking at detainer litigation. Again, people who are being held in jails and then held for extra days because ICE thinks that maybe they should be held because of their immigration status. In other parts of the country, they have actually held U.S. citizens with foreign-sounding names, as it were. These excess days on ICE holds, which is a big part of the problem. We have advocacy staff in our office who are doing Know Your Rights training on immigration issues for communities around the state. We don't do, I want to mention that 83 people were arrested in Wisconsin in September. Almost half had no criminal history. We are continuing to do open records to try to figure out where the communities that most of these folks are coming from are so that we can target some of our education and advocacy efforts. And again, trying to continue to advocate with sheriffs and jails around the state to not necessarily ask everyone for citizenship, to not cooperate with ICE. There's no law that says they have to. And particularly for a lot of these people who are being picked up on civil violations, this is a really critical issue as well. We don't do the kind of individual immigration deportation cases because we don't have the capacity to do that. So we're looking at bigger systemic issues. And I don't have the PowerPoint, but I want to give you an email address because if you hear of people being affected by these sort of broader issues, or a U.S. citizen being detained in jail and being held by ICE, or family separation, or things like that in Wisconsin, you can email us at immigration@aclu-wi.org. immigration@aclu-wi.org, because part of how we develop the work we do is hearing from people who have heard from someone else, oh, this group cares about our civil rights, maybe they can help us, and that's what we want to be here to do. Thank you.